All right. Good afternoon. I am Cadet Crawford, a sophomore at Liberty University's ROTC program, and I'm joined with Mr. Ray Milton, a former Navy lieutenant and a submariner. So you are not retired. Do you want to just quickly describe how that worked following the Cold War?
Sure. Serving in the submarines as a lieutenant, we had, at that point in time in the 80s, during the Cold War, we had about 160, 170 submarines.
Mm-hmm.
And then the wall came down, and so there was no longer the need for that much deterrent force. And so they decommissioned about 100 submarines,
Mm-hmm.
which means you have to decommission 100 submarine crews.
Yes,
So there was more than 1,000 lieutenants, of which I was one, that were basically passed over, and our services were no longer required. So that's when I got out of the Navy. It's just basically laid off.
Mm-hmm. So going back prior to you being a lieutenant, you were commissioned through the Naval Academy. So what made you want to go to the Naval Academy? And secondly, what made you want to join with the Submariner crew?
Okay, well, first, going to the Naval Academy was mostly a fluke.
Mm-hmm.
I did not have my heart set on that initially. Basically, both my parents were school teachers, and my dad played squash, and
Mm-hmm.
nobody plays squash except for my dad and Academy grads.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the YMCA, my dad played squash with some Naval Academy
Mm-hmm.
graduates, and they knew me, and so one of the guys he said, "Here, fill out these forms." And so I put in and went and had an interview. I won't get into that.
Yeah.
I didn't do that well. I actually was not nominated. One of my classmates was nominated, and he went, and he was in 35th Company, and I actually, as an alternate, also got selected. So I went to the Navy because the other alternative was to go to Spokane Falls Community College, and so the Navy seemed like a much better deal.
Okay. So then following that, you commissioned into the Submariner community. So
submarines was, at school, you have to pick your major, and they did a bunch of, first of all, the Naval Academy requires 80% of you to become engineering majors.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in engineering. I liked math, physics, engineering, all that kind of stuff, and I knew I'd want to do that anyway. And as they demonstrated the different majors and what you would do, I just was fascinated by nuclear reactors and the nuclear physics type things. So my major was marine engineering, which is propulsion systems, and that just kind of led naturally into going into the nuclear power program and then picking submarines.
So you were a veteran of the Cold War. So with that in mind, just describe the tensions that led up to the Cold War and what that was like to be a lieutenant in a submarine during the Cold War.
So the tensions were mostly political,
Mm-hmm.
and that drove the operations that we did. I can't describe a lot about that.
Yes, sure.
We did do some interesting things. A lot of cat and mouse things. You've probably, you can read, and there are stories about, submarines, trailing each other and things like that. And so we did a lot of operations. Probably the biggest tension, personally, was just being the weapons officer on a ballistic missile submarine, which, so my job was pulling the trigger to blow up part of the world. So I pretty much prayed all the time that I wouldn't have to do my job. But there's a lot of interesting stories from that too.
Yes, sir.
Just all the training and the drills and things that you have to do when you're underway, just to make sure you can respond. We could respond. Of course, that's still in place.
Mm-hmm.
The response to, I think they call it the football that is carried around for the president to send launch orders and that sort of thing. So,
yes, sir. And also just describe. I know that you went on a few deployments during the Cold War. So just describe those, what units you were with, and what your overall mission, if you can, if that's not classified, if you can describe that, what your mission was as a submariner.
Well, I was on the Richard B. Russell, which no longer exists, I don't think, but in general, the fast attack submarines would do missions deployment missions
So,
where you were doing, you were going, basically overseas to the Mediterranean or Northern Atlantic and had specific tasking that you would do. We also did routine ops, which you'd go, sometimes just go out Monday, come back Friday, so you're gone all week. Shorter term thing. When we'd come back in port, you'd do maintenance. So the shorter term ones were more operation exercises. We'd go with surface ships or go out and try and be found by the anti-submarine aircraft, that kind of thing. But then the deployments were actual tactical or strategic type missions. The fleet ballistic missile submarines, on the other hand, basically had a chunk of ocean that you just drive around at 3 knots. We called it 3 knots to nowhere. And just kind of waiting, hanging out to see if you're supposed to launch your missiles or not. And that attack submarines are trying to find stuff, and the ballistic missile submarines are trying to stay away from everybody and not be found.
So were these submarine tactics that you're describing developed more or less, the tactics that you were using during the Cold War, were they developed in the Cold War, or were they hearkening back to stuff that submariners had learned in previous wars?
A little of both. With the advent of the ballistic missiles, and then you had those on aircraft which would launch, and then there's ones in silos that you could launch, and which are similar to, you put the silo into a submarine. So once they developed those, that was not something that was in World War II at all or anything like that. So that's more of a function of positioning the ship within range of targets, and then trying to make sure that they don't get found, because if you're trying, once you try to launch, you're making a lot of noise, and if somebody's near you, they're going to torpedo you, and then you're done if you get hit by a torpedo. So.
Yes, sir. So just to sum up, coming from a prior serviceman, someone who served during the Cold War, with the conflict that we're in now with the Islamic State, what are your concerns for our servicemen and women given the threat of the Islamic State currently?
I would have to say leadership and security. And security would be, when you're in the military, it's beyond what, a lot of times you get to go home at night, or things like that, and you're a target even then. If you're in uniform or you have a badge displayed, even if you're not in a specific area of conflict, it's a little, in my mind, a little nerve-wracking to think that you could be a target. So you have to be careful, about what you do, what you say when you're out, who you're talking to, leaking information, those kinds of things. Then the other side of that would be, when I say leadership, it starts from the top in terms of strategies that, because that's all different now. And we're used to fighting wars where you're fighting against a country or a nation, and you have armies and you have objectives that you're trying to capture or overcome a battalion or an outpost. And so it's new tactics, and leadership has to figure out what's the best way to deal with this enemy that it's not a state, it's just a bunch of terrorists, really. And it's all new and different. And so that leadership and vision has to go from the top down to the working level, the people that are actually going to execute the actions.
So going back to previous wars, I know I said that was the last question, but going off of that, we've had defined enemies, and here we're in a war where the enemy is relatively undefined, and so far our executive has not been willing to define them. So is that causing a lot of this, the trouble that we're facing in the Middle East, where we have no set enemy that we're saying, we're going to come to your country and we are going to kill you, but with no enemy we really can't do that?
I maybe in a way. I think the enemy is defined, but there are the ability of the enemy to hide, right? Because We know, I mean, intelligence efforts tell you who the leaders are and where they're being trained and those sorts of things. And so part of it's political to bring, pressure on the states where the people are hiding, for those states to take action. And then part of it, like you said, well, we're going to come in, here's our target. So that would be also political because we're saying, hey, this